Okay, the most important thing about the respiratory system is this that you should never forget. Your lungs hate cold, dry air. So although today is 96 degrees and you don't have to worry about it, in February, if you go outside, it's going to be crunchy on the grass. That means if you're taking in a lot of air, it's going to burn your lungs. So your lungs hate cold, dry air. If you remember that, you'll do really well for this first part. So this way, the respiratory system does two things. And the first part of the respiratory system is designed to make sure that your lungs don't get cold, dry air. So the respiratory and circulatory system are closely put together. So the respiratory system is going to supply the body with oxygen and at the same time get rid of the waste product, which is called carbon dioxide. So if you look at this little slide here, pulmonary ventilation, the non-technical term is breathing. You're getting air into your lungs and out of your lungs. And that's called external respiration. It is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood. And that is from the respiratory system. In the circulatory system, which we've already talked about, it's going to transport the oxygen to all of the cells in your body and also take away from all of the cells of your body the carbon dioxide, and that's going to take place in the circulatory system. And it's called internal respiration. It is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between systemic blood vessels and tissues. Okay? That's more lecture than the lab. What we're going to talk about is the organs and what they do concerning why you don't want to have your lungs burning up because you're taking in cold, dry air. So if you look at the major organs, most of them you probably have heard of. The nose and nasal cavity are really the only portions of your respiratory system that you actually see. You really can't look down someone's throat and look at their lungs. So the nose is, for all practical purposes, the only thing that you're going to see. If you ever get a cold and you get an upper respiratory infection, you are going to be influencing some of these parts here. So you all have probably had a cold where your nose runs. That is good because it's doing something. The paranasal sinuses are going to be, in addition to lightening the weight of your skull, be responsible for warming and humidifying the air going into your lungs. And then the pharynx, for all practical purposes, is your throat. So all of you have probably had a cold where I got a sore throat or something like that, and technically you have an upper respiratory infection. When that upper respiratory infection goes a little bit farther south, it could affect your larynx, where you might get laryngitis. It could affect the trachea, which is going to be the tube going down into your lungs. And if you get a really bad infection, it might give you bronchitis, which will allow that infection to go from your nose to your throat down to your bronchi. And then in the worst case scenario, excluding COVID-19, and you have pneumonia, you actually now have fluid inside of your lungs. And we'll talk about that at a later time. So the upper respiratory system, I want to talk to you about what each of the parts does, and that's what we're going to ask you on the practical. So in this picture here, you can kind of see where everything starts. You are either going to breathe in through your nose or through your mouth if you're a mouth breather, and the nose will have air coming up here and going down into your lungs. Same thing with your mouth. It goes to the back of your throat, down the trachea, and into your lungs. One of the things that we're going to talk about when we get to the next section, which is going to be the digestive system, because in addition to breathing through your mouth, you're also going to take food in through your mouth, and it's going to get to the back of your tongue, and a couple things will happen. This thing here, which is called the epiglottis, that we'll talk about because it's really important for the respiratory system, is going to allow food stuff to go down the right pipe. My mother, when I was a kid, said, "Oh, you're choking, it must have gone down the wrong pipe." That's exactly right. So the first pipe here is the trachea. The pipe behind it, which is the larynx, is going to make sure that food goes down. This tube here, which isn't even labeled, is the esophagus and then goes into your stomach. So if you keep that in mind, that this initial portion of your respiratory system is also going to have an influence on your digestive tract too. So these are some of the parts that we'll go through and explain them as I go from slide to slide to slide. So for all practical purposes, the purpose of your nose is to produce mucus, filter, warm, and moisten incoming air. It also is going to provide a resonancing chamber for speech. We don't cover this in the respiratory system, but it's also going to have receptors for smell. The paranasal sinuses, which are the second one there, main purpose is to lighten the weight of your skull. Otherwise, you're going to have like a 16-pound bowling ball for a head, and it's going to lighten it. And it's also going to warm, moisten, and filter the incoming air. As we work our way farther down the respiratory tract, the pharynx is a passageway for either food or air. One of the questions that you'll probably see on the practical, who has the right of way, food or air? And you will probably put down air has the right of way, but I'm going to tell you that the answer is actually food has the right of way. And I'll explain that as we go along. Then we get down to the larynx and then the trachea, and then finally we'll get down to the lungs. So from mostly everything in this beginning is going to be responsible for allowing air to travel down into your lungs. It is nothing more than a passageway. And then eventually, as we get further down into the lungs, we are going to have oxygen and carbon dioxide switch, and you can breathe in the oxygen and breathe out the carbon dioxide. So here is where I'll just go through each one of these parts and tell you what role they play in trying to warm and humidify the air. So as it says there, the nose is the only external portion of your respiratory system. The main functions of the nose is to provide an airway for respiration. And in the second one there, it says it's going to moisten and warm the incoming air. It will also filter and clean the inspired air, and I'll explain that. It's also a resonating chamber for speech and also will house olfactory organs. It's divided into two regions, the external nose and the nasal cavity. So for what we're going to be doing, the external nose, if you want to think of it, it's just really a place to let your glasses rest on your nose. That is not a function of it. It's just a good way to remember what it does. But inside of your nose, the technical name for your nostrils are the nares. That is the opening that you would have on either side of a septum that is mostly going to be considered plates of hyaline cartilage. And you'll see that hyaline cartilage plays a major role with the respiratory system. So let me just get to a picture. Technically, the tip of your nose is all made up of hyaline cartilage. All of this blue stuff here is hyaline cartilage. Your nasal bone doesn't really start until about an inch past the tip of your nose. That's not a question I'm going to ask you, but if you ever broke your nose, it isn't this beginning part, it's somewhere up between your eyes. And it usually hurts a lot. So the nasal cavity is going to have a septum. The septum, which is dividing one nostril into the other, is going to be made up of two bones. One is going to be the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and the other one is the vomer. Remember, it's going to have hyaline cartilage on top of it and then skin on top of that. So basically, the nasal septum, which is dividing you from a right nostril and a left nostril, does have a bony component in it. The nasal vestibule, like, why do I have nose hairs? And the reason for that, they're actually technically called vibrissae. They are nose hairs. They filter coarse particles from inspired air. If you live here in Sinus Valley, which is the Lehigh Valley, you kind of know that there's a lot of pollen that is in the air. And so if you've ever gone to blow your nose, the mucus that's inside of your nose is going to trap the pollen. It may cause you to sneeze, but basically it's to trap things so they don't get into your lungs. Because remember, your lungs hate cold, dry air. So the snot that comes out of your nose is going to consist of olfactory mucosa. It's going to line the superior portion and contain olfactory epithelium. And in addition to that, there's also going to be a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium that makes up the inside of your respiratory mucosa, and it has lots of goblet cells, and it's going to have also, in addition to the goblet cells, secrete or contain many seromucous nasal glands. That basically is what makes up snot. For anyone who wants to think of this as, I always ask in class the question, how many here during the winter have wiped your runny nose on your sleeve? And usually everybody's hand will go up. You don't want to admit it as you get to adult, but most of the time you do. Most of that is that seromucous nasal glands, but in addition to that, you are also going to have water coming out of your nose. So that's kind of interesting, and you'll see that in a few seconds. So in addition to that, they contain enzymes. So the mucus and serous secretions also contain something called lysozyme. It's also going to have cells that will sweep contaminated mucus posteriorly in your throat. So if you've ever had stuff going to the back of your throat, you want to cough it up and get it out. In addition to this, remember your lungs hate cold, dry air. The inside of your nose has a whole bunch of plexuses that have capillaries and veins in the nasal cavity. So as cold air goes over a warm surface, you are creating condensation. Kind of like now, and this is right in the middle of the summer, you have cold air going over, or hot air going over cold coils, and you create condensation. If you have a window air conditioner, it usually drips. Heat pumps do also. So that's part of what's happening. If you're in the winter and you have a warm inside of your nose and cold going over it, you're going to create condensation, or you'll probably think of it as snot. So along with the seromucous cells, that's what you're usually wiping on your tissue or on your sleeve or something like that. So the inspired air, one of the things that happens with the vibrissae, which is the nose hair, is it's going to filter it. But in addition to that, and we haven't even left the nasal cavity yet, those plexuses of capillaries are going to be responsible for warming the incoming air. The nasal mucosa also contains many sensory receptors that can cause sneezing to force out particles out of your nose, which is probably why during our pandemic you wear a mask. If you do sneeze, you are spraying all of these particles all over the place. But anyway, the nose itself is going to filter, it's going to warm and humidify the air that's coming in, because the first thing I said in this particular video is your lungs hate cold, dry air. Inside of your nose, everything in your body is going to have a purpose. If you remember back to A&P1, the inside of your nose has a superior, a middle, and inferior nasal conchae. That is going to be a groove on the inside of your nostrils. Their purpose, in addition to having the indent and the surface that's causing the indent, is to increase the mucosal area, but in addition to that, it's going to enhance air turbulence. So as you're breathing in air, it's not just coming in straight, it's kind of flip-flopping, or tumbling is the word that they usually use, to make sure that the air that's coming in that might be cold is going to be touching as much of the inside of your nose and the warmed veins that are going through it. So the nasal conchae are basically responsible for filtering, heating, and moistening airs during inhalation. And during exhalation, it's going to reclaim the heat and moisture, because remember, your lungs hate cold, dry air. And so if you look at this picture here, you can kind of see, here's the nose, the air coming in, and as it comes in, it's going in swirls, so that as it's swirling, it's hitting the inferior, the middle, and the superior nasal conchae. And because there's capillaries there and blood going through the capillaries, it's going to warm it up. So all of these things are important to make sure that your lungs don't get cold, dry air. In this particular mid-sagittal view, you can kind of see here's the sphenoidal sinus, here's the beginning of the frontal sinus. So all of these sinuses are going to lighten the weight of your skull, but they're also going to help warm and humidify the air that's going into your nose. While we're at this particular picture, although it's not labeled here, this is going to have, this hole right here really has an important part, and so it's going to be the opening that will go to your middle middle ear. So when we look at that, let me just get to the picture, which is a little bit better here, and I'll go back to that. So the nasopharynx is right here. The opening is called, now it's called the pharyngeotympanic tube. 10 years ago, it was called the auditory tube. And when I was going to school 40 years ago, it was called I forget.
Doesn't matter.
So anyway, it's had 3 incarnations. It's now called the pharyngeotympanic tube. And anyway, so I'll just go back one so you can still see the same picture here. So when I go back to this one here, there's going to be the pharynx. The pharynx is the funnel-shaped muscular tube that goes from the base of your skull down to about C6. It connects the nasal cavity in the mouth to the larynx and the esophagus, and it's composed of skeletal muscles. Most people would think of this as their throat. And it has 3 regions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The easiest way to remember this is going to be this picture here. So from the bottom of this thing here, which is your uvula, all the way through here is going to be the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is the only one of your throat that only has air going through it, or should have air going through it. Any time that you have food going through a pharynx, it's going to be composed histologically of stratified squamous epithelium. This part up here to here is composed of pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So although everyone hated histology, that's the difference. The histology here is different than the histology going down the esophagus. The reason for this, and if you've ever had food or water coming through your nose, it burns. And if you remember, stratified squamous epithelium, which makes up your oral cavity, is going to have a sort of defense against having wear and tear on it. But going through your nose, or your nasopharynx, it's going to burn horrendously. If you have ever used something called a neti pot, and you Google neti pot, there's a guy on it who will put saline solution in there and it will clean out your nasopharynx. The next time he does it, he's putting alcohol in it. And he's just, so if you ever had alcohol come out of your nose, it burns terribly. It burns going down your throat, but it's going to burn more coming out of your nose. And so don't have little kids around that one, because he swears a lot, because it must burn. But so as you're having, because you're not supposed to have food come up and out your nose. Anyone who's had little kids probably has had a pee come out their nose, and it's really gross as a parent. But at the same time, water is the same thing. Water coming out of there, it's like pool water. You got it in your nose, it burns up there. You shouldn't have, or be drinking pool water anyway, but anytime you have food going into the pharynx, and the blue portion there is the oropharynx. It is at the back of your tongue, going to about the tip of your epiglottis that I'll get to in a few seconds. And then from the epiglottis down is going to be the laryngopharynx. So those 3 branches make up the pharynx. The nasopharynx is the only one that has only, or is supposed to have water, or only air going through it. The other ones can have air and or food. So that's going back to my original question, who has the right of way? And so food has the right of way. You can have air going into your stomach, and if you're a little baby, think about, they'll have a burp or something like that. But you're really not supposed to be having food going into your nasopharynx. It hurts, and it's not really good for that. So the nasopharynx, here is what this text says. is a passageway from the nose going down the throat. At the back of them, and one of the things I'm going to talk about in this video, and more so in the digestive video, is there's going to be a lot of tonsils in there. And the tonsillar tissue is going to help kill off any bacteria. So a couple things will happen when you swallow food. One of the things that's going to happen is that the soft palate and the uvula will rise reflexively to close off the nasopharynx, because you really don't want food to going up there. The pharyngeal tonsils is called the adenoids. They're in the posterior wall. And the little opening that I mentioned that had your middle ear and to the outside world is called the pharyngeotympanic tube, or like I said, it used to be called the auditory tube, or when I was a kid, it was called the Eustachian tube. Finally remembered that. And so the nasopharynx, as it says here, is the only one that is supposed to have only air going through it. And like I mentioned before, it is composed of pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Working our way inferiorly, the oropharynx has both food and air going through it. And so the easiest way to remember what has what going through it, anytime it has food, think stratified squamous epithelium. It also has tonsils at the back of your tongue, and that's more important for the digestive tract, but it's also having palatine tonsils, because probably the food that you eat and also the air that you inhale, even if it has one speck of pollen in it, that speck of pollen could have thousands of bacteria on it. That's how small it is. So the nasopharynx is made of pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The oropharynx, because it has food and air, is going to be composed histologically of the stratified squamous epithelium. The laryngopharynx also has food and air going through it. And so as long as you got food, you're going to be lining it with stratified squamous epithelium, because that's the important one to make sure. So it's going to extend from the larynx, where it's continuous then with the esophagus. The esophagus is going to be for food. The trachea is going to be for air. So as you look at this picture here, we covered this up through here, and up through here. So here is the nasal cavity. Here are the conchae and the meatuses on in there, and the purpose of them is to tumble air. Here is the opening of the pharyngeotympanic or auditory or Eustachian tube, because that's going to equalize the pressure in your throat and your middle ear. And from here up is going to be made of pseudostratified columnar epithelium. They didn't show it here, but this is where the nose hairs would be. Here is going to be the start of the oropharynx, and it will go down to about the epiglottis. That's going to be the oropharynx. Remember, it's made of stratified squamous epithelium, because you're going to have food come down here. And then as the food comes down here, two things are going to happen. This thing here, which is called the epiglottis, is going to cover the tracheal inlet, because you really don't want to have food going down the trachea or the wrong pipe. And the second thing that's going to happen at the same time is the soft palate, and the end of the soft palate, which is called the uvula, will rise reflexively to close off the nasopharynx so that you don't have food coming out your nose. The larynx is going to be the thing that we'll talk about next, which is going to make sure, particularly the epiglottis portion of it, is going to make sure food goes down the right pipe. Some of the clinical aspects: if you get an infected or swollen adenoids, it can block the air passageway, making it difficult to breathe through your nose, and you become a mouth breather. As a result, air is not properly moistened, and all of that's going to happen in your nasal cavity, warmed or filtered as it reaches the lungs. What is the worst thing that you want? You want to be breathing in cold, dry air. When the adenoids are chronically enlarged, both speech and sleep can be disturbed. And the worst thing about that is you end up snoring like that, which will disturb a significant other and probably neighbors. So that's the beginning of how air gets in there. The rest of the respiratory component is going to be broken up into two branches. One is going to be the conducting zone. That's basically going to be transporting gas down to the gas exchange sites, which are going to be in their lungs. So all the parts that I mentioned so far have the function of cleaning, cleansing, warming, and humidifying the air, because your lungs hate that. Once we get it down into your lungs, it now becomes the respiratory zone, which is where we're going to actually have the gas exchange take place. The larynx is also your voice box. And so the three things that the larynx does are pretty straightforward. It provides a patent airway so that the air can get into your lungs. I think this should be number one rather than that, but it's going to route air and food into the proper channels. Remember, food's supposed to go into your stomach. It's not supposed to go into your lungs. Air is supposed to go into your trachea and then into your lungs. And the third one that we usually don't cover too much here in respiration or the respiratory system is it's also going to be involved with voice production because it houses the vocal cords or vocal folds. So the easiest way to think of this is this picture here. This whole thing is hanging from this bone here, which is called the hyoid bone. And so as it's hanging from it, it is going to have two functions. If you see this little tongue sticking up in the back, it's called the epiglottis. All of the cartilaginous rings are made of hyaline cartilage except for the epiglottis, which is made of elastic cartilage. So as we're looking at this thing, we are just looking at the cartilage of it. And so this big shield looking like thing here is called the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage has a anterior projection, which is in lay language called the Adam's apple, but it's also called the laryngeal prominence. That's what we're going to call it. And because it is not the epiglottis, it's going to be made of hyaline cartilage. So the thyroid cartilage is this big shield here, which is protecting your thyroid, is made of hyaline cartilage. Inferiorly, the cricoid cartilage is also made of hyaline cartilage. And then each of these tracheal rings are also going to be made of hyaline cartilage. So the easy way to remember this is if it's part of the larynx and it's not the epiglottis, it's all going to be made of hyaline cartilage. Let's just go to this thing here. This is a mid-sagittal cut. So here is going to be the epiglottis. It is made of elastic cartilage. Here is the mid-sagittal view of the hyoid bone from which it's hanging. So this thing here is going to cover this tracheal inlet and allow food to go down the esophagus. This portion right here is the cricoid cartilage, and the thyroid cartilage is going to be what you can't really see too much of here. So here's the cricoid cartilage. Here are each of the tracheal cartilages, which are also made of hyaline cartilage. There is also this thing here that I think in this picture looks like a seal balancing this thing here on its tip of its nose. A lot of learning this stuff is how you're going to remember all of this, because there's so much to remember. So the corniculate cartilage, and the reason that I call it that, because it looks like candy corn. If you bit off the little white portion of candy corn, that's what it looks like to me. Here is the thing that looks like a seal in a mid-sagittal view. This is the arytenoid cartilage. So the corniculate cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage. The arytenoid cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage. And you can't see this too well, but the cuneiform cartilage is also made of hyaline cartilage, as is the cricoid cartilage in each of these tracheal cartilaginous rings. If you look at the picture here, here is where we actually have the vocal folds. And I think we have a picture here that's even better. So remember, these are all made of hyaline cartilage, okay? Here is with this thing opening. So as I'm talking, this portion here of the opening is called the glottis. While I'm talking, it has to be open. When I finally shut up, I have them closed. And so in this thing here, the glottis is gone so that you have it closed. When you talk, you are having air go past the glottis. and also your vocal folds, which is allowing you to talk. Up here is the epiglottis, and of course you probably remembered that that thing here is made of elastic cartilage, whereas everything else, here's the corniculate cartilage, here's the cuneiform cartilage, hyaline cartilage, all of that stuff is hyaline cartilage, okay? So, going back to our mid-sagittal view picture, here is going to be the vocal fold right here, which is the true vocal cords, folds, however you want to think of it. And so in order to speak, you are going to have a release of air during the opening and closing of the glottis. Pitch, if you've ever watched American Idol, you know the first week, not everyone is a great singer. Only their mommies told them that they were great singers. And so they have a bad pitch, perhaps. If you want to talk louder and project to the back of a classroom, you don't have to yell. What you really have to do is make the air go past your glottis a little bit faster. And then interestingly, in order to talk, you are going to have the chambers of the pharynx, the oral, the nasal, the sinus cavities amplify and enhance sound quality. If you have a cold, you sound like you're all stuffy. It's because these passageways are all kind of clogged up. Sound, the bottom one there, is shaped into language by muscles of the tongue, the pharynx, and soft palate and your lips. And usually if I was in the actual class, I would ask someone who spoke Spanish really well to trill their R's. I can't do that. I sound like an idiot. But at the same time, there's certain languages that do weird things with their tongue and lips in order to make certain sounds. And so that, if you have no idea what you want to do when you grow up, a speech pathologist would be, why does someone not speak the way that they should be able to speak? But it is kind of interesting that voice production is going to be the opening and closing of the glottis. You can also close your glottis and act as a sphincter. And so it is called a Valsalva maneuver. The glottis will close to prevent exhalation, and you've all done this. So you will close the glottis, you will take a deep breath in, use your ventral body cavity in order to push something out. So if you're going to have a baby or a bowel movement, those are the two I can tell you that can happen. So as it says here, if you're emptying your rectum or even stabilizing your trunk during a heavy lifting, you do that without even thinking. I understand that you also have to close that glottis when they're telling you to push to have the baby. So the intra-abdominal pressure will rise, you are closing your glottis, and you're pushing out, which is interesting. So I get this a lot because I talk a lot, but inflammation of the vocal folds that causes the vocal folds to swell, interfering with the vibration. As a result of that, you can get something called laryngitis. Laryngitis does not necessarily have to be due to a bacteria or a virus, but if you do get it, particularly if you're talking a lot, it could be from overuse, it could be from dry air, it could be from a bacterial infection. You can also have tumors on your vocal folds, and also inhaling irritating chemicals. If you work in a factory and you get a snoot full of some sort of thing that irritates your throat, it may cause laryngitis where you end up talking like a whisper. Anyway, so a laryngitis is an inflammation of those vocal folds, and it interferes with the vibrations of your vocal cords so that you end up having to whisper. The trachea is what we're sending our air through. It is a windpipe that extends from the larynx to the middle of your chest, which is called the mediastinum. It's about 4 inches long, about 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and it is very, very flexible. Inside of this is going back to the histology that we covered in AMP1. Let me just show you a picture of it here. So if we make a cut through the trachea right here at this level, this thing that's blue, because it's made of hyaline cartilage, really does look like hyaline cartilage. The inside of the lumen of the trachea is going to have these seromucous cells that are going to secrete stuff that's going to make sure that the air that gets into your lungs is going to be warmed and humidified. And if you look at this here, posterior to the trachea is going to be the next tube, and the next tube is going to be the esophagus, which is not even labeled there. So, no, it is labeled here. The tube back here, if you think of this as a horseshoe, it's a horseshoe that has it's all made of hyaline cartilage. So the hyaline cartilage at the back here has a muscle. It is smooth muscle. And so at the back of the trachea, easy way to remember it is, it's called the trachealis. So when you're trying to clear your throat, something like that, you are squeezing this thing together, and the trachealis muscle will allow it to flex a little bit, because these are very, very flexible. So if you even poke someone in the throat, you are at risk of damaging this tracheal ring. Here's what it looks like at 320x. Here's the hyaline cartilage down here. Here's going to be the submucosa that has the seromucous glands. And then the superior portion in this slide here is going to be the pseudostratified columnar epithelium. On the outside, in this particular picture, this thing that looks like little fuzz out there is cilia. So in this particular case, ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, when anything touches any of this cilia, it's going to initiate a cough reflex. Because remember, all of this is to make sure that cold, dry air doesn't go down into your throat. The same thing, you get a drop of water touching that, it's going to initiate a cough reflex. A little speck of powdered sugar can cause you to have a cough reflex. Your body doesn't know that it's just a little speck of sugar. Your body knows it's trying to get it out. So a lot of times I look at that as my ab workout. You start coughing so violently, your ab muscles hurt because you're trying to cough it up. Technically, you're probably not going to cough up a speck of powdered sugar or a drop of water, but those cilia are responsible for making sure that anything touches there, your nervous system is going to attempt to cough it out. The bad thing about this is if you smoke. If you smoke, you are going to kill off all of these cilia, and that's why chronic smokers have dry hacking coughs, because you're not supposed to be getting the mucus going down into your lungs. Here's what a scanning electron micrograph looks like. They look like a scrubbing bubble of the cilia. So when anything touches these little things here, it's going to initiate a cough reflex. Here's where it says smoking inhibits and ultimately destroys the cilia. Without the ciliary activity, coughing is the only way to prevent mucus from accumulating in your lungs. And that's the reason smokers with respiratory congestion should avoid medication that inhibits the cough reflex, because it's just going to go down into their lungs and they'll probably get pneumonia. The other thing with this, if you ever have a tracheal obstruction, like a piece of hamburger went down the wrong pipe. So one of the things that can happen is you can use your ventral body cavity to do something called the Heimlich maneuver, in which case you get underneath the rib cage, you kind of get behind him, you kind of pop it posteriorly, and you can pop out the piece of meat or something like that. So for any of you who have little kids, particularly if they're first eating hot dogs, cut the hot dog in half, because the diameter of a hot dog is about the same diameter of a child's trachea. And so if you cut it in half, that means half of it is not going to clog it up. As long as they're still gasping or something, that means they're not choking. So the air passageways undergo 23 branchings as they get down from the conducting zone down to the respiratory zone. You don't have to remember all 23 of them. We're going to make it easy for you. Let me just get to a picture so you can kind of see this. Here is the trachea coming down. Then it's going to branch into the right and the left lung. These branchings here, this portion right here is called the carina. The carina for me looks like SpongeBob SquarePants' underwear. The carina is, I think it does. So remember, this is all hyaline cartilage. as is this thing here going into here. So the first branch after the carina is going to be the primary or the main bronchus. So we're going to have primary, secondary, and then there is no such word as thirdary, so we're going to have tertiary. So we're going to have three branches that you need to know going down to the little ends of these, which are going to be the alveoli, which are going to be where gas will take place, gas exchange will take place. So all of this is hyaline cartilage. The carina is the last one that is going to be all hyaline cartilage. These are going to have cartilage plates. But from there, you're going to go into the lung. And you'll notice that there's a difference between the right lung on here and the left lung on the left side. And so while this picture is up, that's something else we'll ask you about. This one has three different lobes. A superior or upper lobe, which is separated by the horizontal fissure here, which will separate the superior from the middle lobe. The middle lobe is separated from the inferior or the lower lobe by this oblique fissure here on the right side. So if you had lung cancer down in the lower portion, they can just cut through this fissure and still save 2/3 of your lung. But as we're getting air down into it, we're going to go primary, secondary, and then tertiary. And then, like it said before, there's 23 divisions, and I'll show you a picture of that later. So on the right side, we're going to have superior, middle, or inferior, or upper, middle, and lower. On the left side, we're going to have two divisions. The top one is going to be the superior lobe, and it's going to be separated by the oblique fissure. And the inferior lobe will be this part here. Now we're going to have a big indent here where the heart would go, and that's called the cardiac notch. But the divisions are going to be of the trachea into the carina, into the primary, the secondary, and then off of that would be the tertiary lobe. But you can see that there is a difference between the right versus the left. Right is upper, middle, lower, and the left is going to be upper and middle. The left side has the cardiac notch, and then the bottom here would be the base, which is actually going to sit on the diaphragm, and the pointy part up here is going to be the apex. If you remember, the apex of the heart is pointing down towards your left hip. So one of the things that will happen going from the conducting into the respiratory zone is you're going to make some changes. The cartilaginous rings will become plates of cartilage. The epithelium will change from a pseudostratified columnar epithelium and then will become more cuboidal, simple cuboidal. And so really, if you get something going down there, you're not going to be able to cough it back up. So at the end of the respiratory zone, we're going to have sacs. And here's a picture of it here. So here is the left lung. Here is this part right down here. We're going to go down, 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 primary, secondary, tertiary, 23 divisions down to the end of the bronchial tube, which will go into the respiratory bronchiole. And to me, these always look like clusters of grapes. And if you think of that, that's really a good way to look at the alveolar cluster. And there's actually a better picture so that you can understand it. Like a cluster of grapes, these things are called alveolar pores or alveoli, and they're going to have little pores that are going to go from here to here. So if you get pneumonia and you get all sorts of fluid down here and there's a little pocket of oxygen, you really don't want to lose it. And so each one of these micrograph pictures of the alveoli are going to be representing what you see over here in the cartoon picture. So air is kind of important, so we don't want to lose it. We'll try and breathe it back out through the alveolar pore. The membrane, which is going to be simple squamous epithelium, is very, very thin. And so simple diffusion is going to be how we're going to have oxygen get into our bloodstreams and carbon dioxide get back out. So there's a couple things that you need to see about this picture. So I've exploded that picture, and so this one here, not only does it have capillaries around each one of these alveoli, it also has elastic fibers around each one of these alveoli. So this would also be around each one of those, and if you think of it as a cluster of grapes, you've got the elastic fibers around it, and then around it, because these are only 1 cell thick, you're going to have the capillary system. And here is an electron micrograph cast of when they collapse it. That's going to be the capillary cast of it. So this cartoon picture is probably the easiest way to understand it. So here is going to be an alveoli. Here is going to be a alveolar pore. So if there was oxygen here and this got congested, it can kind of go from one to the next channel and work its way back out. Here is where we're going to have carbon dioxide simply diffuse across this 1 cell membrane and get into the bloodstream. The bloodstream, or the red blood cell, is going to get rid of the carbon dioxide because it's only 1 cell thick, and go into here, and work its way up and out of your mouth through the respiratory system. So back to this picture here. This is a good picture where you can kind of see the trachea. And it's going to go into the right lung and the left lung. Superior lobe, middle lobe, inferior lobe. Here is the base, which is resting right on top of the diaphragm. Here's the cardiac notch where the heart will kind of hang out. And here on the left side will be the superior, the oblique fissure, and the inferior lobe. And you can kind of see one of the things that's going to happen on the outside of the lung and the inside of the rib cage. This is something going back to 2 words that we use in AMP1. This is going to be the visceral pleura, which is going to be like the example I always use. It's going to be the saran wrap wrapping around the lung. I used the same example when we did the heart. And then that saran wrap is also going to line all of the inside of your rib cage. So you're going to have the visceral pleura, a space between them called the pleural cavity, and then the parietal pleura is going to be on the inside of your rib cage. By having that arrangement, as you take a deep breath in, you really don't want to have your outside of your lungs sticking to the inside of your rib cage. So the pleural cavity is going to have serous fluid there. So as you take a deep breath in, you want to make sure it's not sticking to the inside of your rib cage. The same thing with your heart. You did not want to have your heart, the outside of your heart sticking to the inside of where the heart lives. That's called a pericardial friction rub. And of course, in the lung, it's called pleurisy. So here is a cast of going from the trachea into the primary bronchi, secondary, tertiary, and then 23 divisions all the way out here to where you would have an alveoli. And so that's about enough for the first slide. I'll talk the next one about the respiratory physiology, which will explain the nerves and the diaphragm dropping and stuff like that. So here's so the pleural fluid, which is going to be in that cavity, is going to make sure there's a lubrication so that the outside of your lungs don't stick to the inside of your rib cage. And pleurisy is the inflammation of that pleura, often resulting from pneumonia. The inflamed pleura become rough, resulting in friction and stabbing pain with each breath. And pleura may produce excessive amounts of fluid, which may exert pressure on your lungs and hindering your breathing. And that's it for round 1. So it is kind of interesting. You all do it. It's called breathing. And to stay healthy, you have to breathe and then keep repeating that.